Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring. You joined me today for a very special video because, as some of you may have noticed, the channel now has more than 2,000 subscribers, and that is absolutely incredible. It actually blows my mind to think that we have over 2,000 people on the channel now. It's one of those things that I guess when I started this channel, obviously the aim was always to build the audience. The aim was always to have a large audience, but I guess I never really thought I would get anywhere close to the figures we now have, and that's really exciting to me. It's incredible, and so I just wanted to thank everybody who watches any of the videos, anybody who comments, anybody who likes, anybody who subscribes. If you aren't subscribing at the moment, do please consider subscribing. It really does help, and like I say, I'm just absolutely blown away by the support that the channel has had. Now, I would love to think that the reason that we've got over 2,000 subscribers is because of my scintillating personality and sparkling wit, but I am aware that quite a few of my subscribers are here for Blackstone Fortress content. So I was thinking, what do I do for my video to celebrate 2,000 subscribers? And I thought, well, why not talk a little bit about the board game line that has helped to get me to that figure. So today I'm just going to ramble a little bit, I guess, about the evolution of modern Warhammer Quest from Silver Tower through to where we are today with Blackstone Fortress, which I hope some people will find interesting. I'm not exactly an expert, I'm not a board game historian, but this is one of my favourite board game lines of all time, so you'll forgive me if I have a little meander through the years as we explore how we got to where we are. So obviously the original Warhammer Quest is a classic from back in 1995, and as a kid I spent a huge number of evenings and weekends playing Warhammer Quest. It stands as a monument to dungeon crawling, I suppose. It's the one game that, when you think of dungeon crawling, a lot of people will go back to Warhammer Quest and say it's the granddaddy. It's kind of the foundation that many other games are built on. And it was one of the most generous board games ever. It opened up so many different ways to play. You could play it solo. In fact, the game was actually built from the ground up as having a solo experience, which wasn't the first time the Games Workshop had worked on making a game soloable. They had numerous other games that you could play solo. In fact, Advanced Hero Quest had solo rules, and there was Chainsaw Warrior, which was a solo experience as well. But it was a game that, at a time when there weren't a lot of games that you could play on your own, it was a game that offered that opportunity. It obviously offered the opportunity to play as a cooperative experience where you could get some of your mates round, everybody take on the role of a character in a dungeon crawling party, and go and have some adventures. But then it also had the option to play against a dungeon master, an adversary, and it came with a thick role-playing book that actually converted the game into this sort of hybrid role-playing game where you could really advance your characters and develop new skills, spend a lot of time in towns and doing other stuff. And it was just absolutely packed with content. There were stats for basically every creature that Games Workshop had miniatures for at the time. And it was well supported too. Games Workshop regularly published things in White Dwarf magazines. There were expansions for it. There were adventure packs like the Lair of the Orc Lord, and there were also hero packs which came with everything you needed to play a new type of hero, like the pit fighter or the noble. So it was a really big product, and for a little while it was a game that had a lot of support and a lot of attention. But as much as I loved Warhammer Quest, and I guess still do for the important role it had in my childhood, when I reviewed Warhammer Quest on my blog a little while back, I said, it's not a very good game. The nostalgia in me means it always has a place in my heart, and it always will. But everybody I've introduced Warhammer Quest to has not enjoyed it. I go into a lot of detail in my written review as to why that is. So I did say in my review that there are many games that deserve to be constantly in print, and there are many games that are as fantastic now as they were then. And I don't think Warhammer Quest is one of them. For me, probably the best dungeon crawling game, certainly from Games Workshop anyway, was Advanced Hero Quest. And Advanced Hero Quest was so in-depth, it was so intricate, it was so detailed. It had a magic system where you had to actually gather the ingredients before you could cast a spell, and once you cast a spell the ingredients were gone and you would have to go and buy the ingredients again to do it again. And until that point your wizard was basically unarmed and incredibly vulnerable to attacks. You had an elf with a bow and arrow, but he had a limited number of arrows. He didn't have the machine gun bow and arrow that the elf from Warhammer Quest had. And you would use your arrows to kill enemies, and you would scrabble together a few coins so that you could go back to town and buy more arrows so you could do it again. You had to deal with what you did with your money when you were on a quest. You had to sort of lock it away and protect it. You had to pay for lodgings. Everything was a very painful slog. It really gave a true sense of what life in the old world must be like. And even looking in the rulebook at the artwork in the rules book, most of the images showed heroes and their henchmen facing horrible deaths. It was a gritty game, a gritty experience, and very, very clever, and probably one at the time anyway, that possibly the game that skirted closest to a Dungeons and Dragons type role-playing game, while still being very much a board game. You could roll up new characters, and you had all that sort of good stuff and good storytelling opportunities. And Advanced Hero Quest, much like Warhammer Quest, is a fantastic game. But Advanced Hero Quest, much like Warhammer Quest, when I played it a few years back, I just didn't enjoy it. It's beautifully meticulous in its construction of a world, and it has so much going for it, and it's so beautifully put together, and it really is a fantastic product. But I found it a draining, grinding game. It was too realistic in a way. This is another game that I have reviewed on my blog, and I go into a lot of detail there as to exactly why that is. It's quite difficult to explain. And to reiterate, I'm not saying these are bad games. They are not. These are both fantastic games that, for me, now have shown that they are of their time, and I will love them forever for their nostalgic value. But introducing them to people nowadays, they do not generate that same awe. Being there when they came out, playing them back in the day, is what has given them their value and persistence. And people coming to those games new for some people, they're going to play them and go, oh wow, these are fantastic games. But other people may play them and go, what's the big deal? Why was this so important to so many people? Why has it maintained its position as something that other dungeon crawlers are aspiring to? But that was then. That was back in the day. New Warhammer Quest, the new product line that has led to Blackstone Fortress, arrived in 2016. When I was looking at the original Warhammer Quest in my review, I was saying that we didn't need Warhammer Quest to come back as it was. We needed something new. We needed something that was updated, something that was evolved. And Games Workshop clearly were thinking the same thing, because Silver Tower nods to Warhammer Quest. It has elements of Warhammer Quest, but it is a very different thing. It's its own creature in its own right. I pretty much instantly fell in love with it. As soon as I knew that Warhammer Quest was coming back and it was getting spruced up, I was sold. I was instantly setting aside money to purchase this game. But at that time, even I didn't know really what to expect from it. And what I got was something fantastic, something very, very special. One of the designers involved with Silver Tower was James Hewitt, who has also worked on some other very, very good Games Workshop games. He worked on Betrayal at Calth, which is a wonderful hex-based squad-level skirmish game based around scenarios. And he also worked on Gore Chosen. Now, Gore Chosen was recently remade as Combat Arena, which interestingly is a Blackstone Fortress prequel that features characters that eventually appeared in the Blackstone Fortress Escalation expansion. So there's James Hewitt's fingerprints have been somewhat left over the Warhammer Quest product line, which is no bad thing because he is incredibly talented. He's also more recently worked on the Hellboy adventure game, which I've never played, mainly because I like Hellboy, I like the Hellboy movies, but I don't have enough love for that particular character and those particular comics to invest in a board game about them. But I've heard good things about it. But anyway, the birth of Silver Tower sort of came from Games Workshop creating a bunch of miniatures and then handing them to James Hewitt and the other designers and saying, we need a Warhammer Quest game built around these miniatures. And that can be a very bad way to design a game. There was the game Mighty Warriors and a few other old Games Workshop games that were actually built that way. And I think most of Games Workshop games sort of start with the miniatures even now to this day. And it can be a bad thing to do because you're writing for miniatures rather than choosing miniatures that complement your rule set. But they did a great job with Silver Tower. You can see little elements in the rules where you can see how those rules came about. For example, because there are two frames of miniatures that are identical, there were two Skaven in Silver Tower, and therefore when the rules were written for the Skaven character, they made these really clever shadowing rules where he could create a doppelganger of himself and you didn't know which one was the real assassin and which one was the fake. And that was a really clever way to get around the fact that we had two miniatures because they had two frames in the box. So things like that, it was one of those things where the miniatures were there and they had to work those into the rules, and it worked really nicely. But it is something that can backfire when you do things that way. But the big thing about Silver Tower, the thing that I ended up really loving, is it became it's like a social storytelling experience, that's how I refer to it in my written review on my blog. It had this really interesting concept of all these different disparate warriors from different backgrounds all going to this Silver Tower, this Tzeentch Tower. And the narrative was that they're not even heroes, they're just adventurers, all sort of thrown together through necessity in this ever-shifting, maddening tower where chaos thrives. It's a really cool setting, and it meant that they could have really beautiful boards with even the grids for movement on the boards aren't regimented. They go off on slight angles and they're staggered, and it made for really beautiful artwork on the boards. I think a lot of people looked at those boards and were like, well, hold on, this isn't like a dungeon crawl, it looks like some really weird setting. And it was a really weird setting, but it was still a dungeon crawl. I really appreciated that sense of coming out of the sewers, coming out of the dungeons, coming out of your traditional gloomy fungus-filled, moss-riddled, bloody chambers of death into something elegant and sparkling and beautiful. It was like an elevation of Warhammer Quest. It was taking it out of the ground and lifting it up on a pedestal, and that's exactly what I think the product line needed for the launch of a new game in this respected product line. And I'm not going to talk too much about how the game actually works, but one of the interesting aspects of it was that you would choose a mission from a mission book, and that would tell you what cards to use to actually create a random dungeon. And then as you explored the dungeon, you would flip the cards. So much like in Warhammer Quest, However, when you flip the cards, they would then key to a reference book, and then you would read the reference book to get specific encounters for those rooms. So the same room card could have multiple different encounters linked from a reference book. Like I said, it was like a social storytelling experience, but not like Winter Tales or something like that. It was kind of like Tales of the Arabian Nights. It was like a very fancy choose your own adventure book where you could go through this adventure, and the fact it had a book meant that they could put a lot more character and narrative into everything that was happening and everything you were doing. So things like characters didn't just turn up in a room, they would be vomited out of the wall by a screaming chaotic mouth or something, and it just allowed for a more in-depth understanding of your environment. You weren't just in a cave in the ground, you were in this tower that had its own personality and its own sense of story to it. And there were a series of missions in this book, and you would play through them all to create a kind of campaign of linked adventures. But you could swap out your heroes in between adventures. You didn't have to have the same characters, and you got a real sense that it was just a huge group of characters just wandering around this tower, and sometimes they would cross paths and work together for a while, and then they would separate and go off again on their different ways. And that sense of narrative and semi-randomness is something that eventually would go on into Blackstone Fortress. It's also worth noting that Silver Tower was funny. It had a lot of humour built into it, and it was a very meta game as well. When you open the rules book for Silver Tower, one of the first things you're greeted with was a picture of 4 Tzeentch gods rolling dice and towering over small hero figures. And quite clearly the suggestion is that the players are these Tzeentch characters, and they are controlling these plastic miniatures which represent these heroes. You're the puppet masters in this story, and there's certain events throughout the game where it would hint that your hero wasn't going to do what it wanted to do because it didn't like the roll of a dice or something like that. So it had lots of little moments that said, yes, there is your players playing a game. Unfortunately, of course, Silver Tower is out of print now, and also it didn't get a lot of love in terms of expansions. There were 2 miniature packs, which were literally just miniatures. There was 1 pack of hero cards, which enabled you to purchase other Games Workshop characters and then use them in Silver Tower. And there were some heroes and enemies in White Dwarf magazine. At a stretch, you could say there was a start collecting Tzeentch box set, which included a lot of demonic enemies that were in the rules book for Silver Tower, but didn't actually include the miniatures in the box for those characters. So you could argue that that box was also like an expansion for the game. But there wasn't any boxed set new missions or anything, and I think that was one of the things that once people played through this mission and completed this entire scenario, they wanted more, and there wasn't necessarily more coming, not from expansions. Games Workshop weren't in the habit at that point of offering much in the way of expansions for their non-core games. But this game did create the foundation for modern Warhammer Quest. It did numerous things that have continued through the game series or have evolved in some way. And there was also little hints and little things that might have influenced decisions later on. For example, in Silver Tower there are no critical hits. So there's no way of rolling a critical hit when you're attacking something. However, the wound tokens that they gave in Silver Tower had 1 wound on one side, and if you flip them over they had 3 wounds on the other side. And I do wonder whether that in some way informed the 1 wound or 3 wounds setup that we have for Blackstone Fortress when you get a critical hit. It also made several little nods to Advanced Hero Quest again. One being in Advanced Hero Quest, the main adventure that they included with Advanced Hero Quest involved collecting shards of an amulet, and once again in Silver Tower collecting the shards of the amulets is kind of your goal, and you actually had little tokens that fitted together like a little jigsaw to create the amulet, which was pretty cool. But the main things that it set down for Warhammer Quest were The idea of the activation dice, where at the start of your turn you roll your dice and you set them out on your character sheet, and then you can use those dice values to perform a specific action, so how your heroes actually work. It also incorporated the idea of destiny dice, those extra dice that you can roll at the start of the activation phase and then draw on to do extra actions. The general concept of the enemy behavior, rolling on enemy charts, was created here. The introduction of little mini games were first seen in Silver Tower. There were things like dice stacking games and little dexterity tests. And most of all, I think it set the tone of the uneasy alliance, which is something that has perpetuated through the Quest line, and yet I'm not necessarily sure whether it's ever really worked 100%. The concept is that although you're working together, you're supposed to have opportunities to stab each other in the back. You're all supposed to be racing for the best loot. You're supposed to be racing to get the experience points for yourself. You're not supposed to be a cohesive team. You're a group of people that just happen to be in this place at the same time. But I don't think that's ever really worked. Some people enjoy playing it that way. I know I've seen people comment and say that the best way to play the game is to, occasionally screw over your friends and things like that, but I've never found that with Silver Tower, and for me, this game is best as a cooperative experience. You can play it solo, obviously, but I feel like when you're reading sections from a book, like in Silver Tower, it becomes this social storytelling experience, and when you're reading sections of a book to yourself, all alone, you do lose a little bit of what makes this game so much fun. So I do think this is best as a cooperative experience. And this is interesting to note because there have now been 3 different box sets for the modern Warhammer Quest, and each of them, I think, offers something different, a different take on how to play a dungeon crawling game. So Silver Tower is the co-op option for me. In 2017, which was a very fast turnaround, Shadows over Hammerhal came out. And for me, Shadows over Hammerhal was the other half of the same coin, because it added in all the stuff that Silver Tower was missing and left out all the stuff that Silver Tower did. So it introduced the concept of an adversary, a dungeon master, but it took away cooperative play. It took away the opportunity to play solo. Whereas Silver Tower had lots of cool new miniatures, Shadows over Hammerhal was reusing all old miniatures. And while Silver Tower used cards to generate semi-random dungeons, Shadows over Hammerhal used pre-mapped adventures like you would see in the original Hero Quest. And in fact, for me, Shadows over Hammerhal always felt a little bit like Advanced Hero Quest, because there were certain things in Advanced Hero Quest that gave it its character, and one of them was when you go into a dungeon in Advanced Hero Quest, you have to map the dungeon. You actually have to draw the map out on a piece of grid paper, and that carried over into Shadows over Hammerhal. You had to map the dungeons, and the reason you had to map the dungeons is because the whole game of Shadows over Hammerhal is taking place in one dungeon. It's just a dungeon on lots of different levels. You could go up and down stairs to different flights of the dungeon, then go back to a previous area, revisit it, come into a level of the dungeon from a different end, so you think you're somewhere new, but you're actually in a bit of the dungeon you've already explored before, and eventually, as you're drawing it, you'll go, oh, hold on, we've already been here, looking at my map. So they had this whole concept of mapping a dungeon, and at certain points being able to leave and go back and visit the town and heal up. Shadows over Hammerhal, I think, was somewhat maligned, because I think as soon as people found out that there was no cooperative experience, a lot of people immediately switched off. But Shadows over Hammerhal is fantastic, and it does work in conjunction with Silver Tower. Like I say, it does feel like the games are two halves of the same coin. It gives you, when you want to play with an adversary, you can play Shadows over Hammerhal, and you get a really interesting story. And story is what Shadows over Hammerhal is all about. The pre-generated dungeons mean they can add so much more interesting stuff. There's traps that the dungeon master knows when they're going to trigger, and like I say, they all link together in interesting ways. You can go down a stairwell, explore somewhere, come up a stairwell, and be in a different area of a place that you couldn't get to before. The story was more elaborate, and particularly what Shadows over Hammerhal did, which was very exciting for me, was it expanded the Age of Sigmar universe. Age of Sigmar, I like the Age of Sigmar universe, but I grew up in the old world, so I have a great love for the old world. But Age of Sigmar, it's interesting in a different way, and it kind of reminds me of like the old Greek mythology with gods and monsters, and everything felt massive and overblown. And my one concern with Age of Sigmar was I never got a sense of what everyone was fighting for. It's like, great, Sigmar's fighting back against Chaos, but why? What's at stake? Who's losing out here? Who's living in the shadow of these deities? And Shadows over Hammerhell really helped to flesh out that concept, because it created a living, breathing city. It created Hammerhell. And the rulebook even has a quite expansive novella at the start, which introduces the characters, but it also introduces the setting, it introduces the town. And it had little interesting snippets about stormcasts and things that we as players may have been asking, and characters within the stories were asking the same thing. There's a really fantastic bit where the Stormcast is being attacked by an enemy, and the enemy wants to remove the Stormcast helmet because he wants to know what's inside, because he doesn't know what he's fighting. Is it a god? Is it just a pure energy? Is there a body inside? And it also gave an insight into how the Stormcast feel. The Stormcast had always felt like these immortal beings that don't have any sense of what they're doing, but the Stormcast in the story, he looks at the people that and he feels like he's failing them, because no matter how many times he fights, no matter how many times he dies, chaos is still prevalent, and these people are struggling in the shadow of darkness all the time. And it was really interesting, and that really helped to ground the epic fantasy by saying, yes, there are people, just normal everyday humans. There is that sense to it. And there were a lot of little pictures and things in the Shadows over Hammerhell book that felt like references back. In fact, even the name Shadows over Hammerhell referencing back to the old world role-playing game, Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game. So that was exciting for me. And it got a little bit by way of expansions. There was a pack of adversary cards which allowed you to use most of Games Workshop's chaos creatures to add into your dungeons. And there were some White Dwarf articles for heroes and enemies. But most importantly, there was the precursor really to what they do for Blackstone Fortress now. There was a 3-part series in White Dwarf of new content which expanded what happened in the town when you returned to town, but also added 3 side quests. And side quests is something that they have been introducing in White Dwarf for Blackstone Fortress, so this sort of set that style in place. It also introduced the concept of henchmen, or people that you could hired help. There was already a retinue character in the form of the Gryph-hound, and this was the first use of retinue characters in Warhammer Quest. Later on in the adventure, you can find the Gryph-hound, and then the Gryph-hound will serve as part of your heroic team for the rest of the campaign. And then there were these White Dwarf characters that you could actually hire for one-off quests, and they would come with you, and they were basically the retinue characters that we see now in Blackstone Fortress. And that wasn't a completely original concept. In Hero Quest, there was not the original Hero Quest game, but when they released Hero Quest Advanced, not Advanced Hero Quest, but Hero Quest Advanced, they introduced the concept of being able to hire some help to go with you. And then in Advanced Hero Quest, there were henchmen that you could hire as well, which used to die horrible deaths and cost quite a lot of money. So they were kind of building on those concepts that they had used in older games, whilst setting out how they were going to advance this product line going forwards. And those side quests from White Dwarf, they were really good. They were really interesting because they gave you a chance to break away from your main adventure. So you could have a little side quest and go and fight some different types of enemies. So overall, Shadows over Hammerhell was quite a considerable evolution from Silver Tower, whilst also feeling very much like the same game, the other half of the game. Whereas the original Warhammer Quest put everything in one box. You had your solo, your co-op, and then you had that role-playing book. Now, as modern Quest, we got it spread over 2 boxes. It is a shame that things like skills and items in Hammerhell had different card backs to how they have them in Silver Tower. I still lumped them all together so that you could And what I did was I would draw from the bottom of the deck, so I didn't know whether I was going to get a Silver Tower card or a Hammerhal card. But they would have done better thinking ahead and actually having those cards have the same back, or at the very least releasing a pack of deck protectors with standard imagery on the back so that you could put all your cards in those deck protectors and in those card sleeves and not be able to tell where you were getting your skills and items from. But obviously the Dungeon Master was the big inclusion. It was also the first use of Grievous Wounds. Grievous Wounds, the terminology, had been used in Silver Tower, but in Silver Tower, being wounded grievously meant you had taken all of your damage to fill up all your slots on your character card, and you would be taken off the board, and then at the start of the next turn you would come back, and you would still have all your wounds on, but you would be back in the action. There was no sense of persistent injury. Once they came to Hammerhal, when you took all of your wounds and you were taken off the board, when you came back on the board, you would have a grievous wound, a permanent, persistent injury that permanently reduced the number of actions you could take by 1 until you returned to town, and returning to town would heal that grievous wound. And that was our first use of grievous wounds in this product line, something which obviously became much more significant again in Blackstone Fortress. But overall, I think Hammerhal just fleshed everything out more. It created more of the world, and it's interesting that the White Dwarf content even introduced the idea that you could go from Hammerhal to Silver Tower and then have the Dungeon Master control the Silver Tower for you as well. So they did kind of tie everything together whilst increasing the complexity a little bit. No, I don't mean making it difficult to learn, but I mean adding more things like Grievous Wounds. And certain things like the Grievous Wounds were very easily backwards compatible. If you were just playing Silver Tower as a solo game or whatever, it was very easy to add Grievous Wounds, and that would actually bump the challenge difficulty, because even back then, with Silver Tower, there were people claiming that the game was far too easy, which is something that they still say about Blackstone Fortress to this day. But overall, for me, this is the one versus many game. If you've got someone who wants to be the adversary, and in board games, I don't normally like being a Dungeon Master. I actually love being the Dungeon Master for Dungeons & Dragons, but when playing board games, I tend to like being a hero. But I absolutely loved running Shadows over Hammerhal as the adversary, and I loved having the maps in front of me so I could see what was going on. So this is the one versus many game. Although I should notice as well that obviously fans have worked on some fan content to be able to run the game as a solo experience. And of course, that brings us up to the release of Blackstone Fortress, which came in, I believe, November of 2018. So about just shy of 2 years from Hammerhal to Blackstone Fortress. And what Blackstone Fortress did was it combined all that wonderful narrative from Hammerhal and spliced in the semi-randomness of the Silver Tower dungeon generation, and allowed for solo, co-op, versus mode. It just brought everything together and then flung it through time into the realm of 40,000, leaving the Age of Sigmar behind. And it took all of those core concepts, and some of them it kept as is, and then some of them it evolved, and some of them it fleshed out. It did certain things that maybe weren't such a good move. I think my one regret is that they switched to custom dice. I'm still a big fan of the old D6 myself, but they introduced custom dice for actions. Finally, we get the concept of critical hits. We have the persistent grievous wounds, but now they can be inflicted just from a powerful strike rather than actually taking all of your wounds. We have the concept of an exploration deck where you're drawing exploration cards to explore, which could be seen as an evolution of Silver Tower and the idea of every time you go through a room you draw a new card. But what Blackstone Fortress does differently is you don't have a persistent map on the table. You're not moving from room to room on a map. It actually is lifting a mechanism that I remember from Advanced Space Crusade. In Advanced Space Crusade, you would have teams of Marines, and you would choose different flanks to advance through as they were going through the hive. And so you would have like your left flank advancing, your right flank advancing. There was a central attack, and you would have decks of exploration cards for each area of attack, and you would flip the cards, and sometimes there would be an event, like you find an ally, or you find a different type of monster, and then sometimes you would find a combat, and at that point the adversary player, the Tyrannid player in the case of Advanced Space Crusade, would set up a map, and then you would fight over the map. And that's very much what Blackstone Fortress is doing. You're exploring through a deck of cards and then only creating a map to fight over when a combat breaks out. It also, of course, fleshed out the whole town experience. Precipice is very much an important part of what you're doing. It's how you get most of your items, and it's very integral to the story as well. They fleshed out the behavior for the enemies. Now you have very detailed enemy charts. You roll per enemy rather than per enemy group, and even how the enemy is armed will reflect in what they do. Enemies with guns are more likely to take cover and snipe at you at range, whilst obviously the ones with the melee weapons are going to charge forwards and attack you that way. And one of the most important things, they started putting art on the cards. This was something that bugged me with Hammerhal, it bugged me with Silver Tower. Games in those settings, just a little bit of artwork on the cards can make all the difference, but none of the items and skills in Hammerhal or Silver Tower had any artwork on. In Blackstone Fortress, they started adding artwork on the cards, and it just, when you've got such a rich environment, when you've got such a rich narrative, a little bit of artwork is, I mean, it's not essential, obviously, but it really does help. Although I do find that to a certain degree, having a little bit of artwork on a card does make it easier to quickly locate which card you need information from when they're all laid out in front of you, rather than having to parse across blocks of text on each card. So a little image does have a certain degree of functionality as well. And of course, Games Workshop have really gone to town with Blackstone Fortress. There have been lots of expansions. I've bought every single expansion when it has come out, and I will continue to do so. We obviously have more to come, because they've already teased the Zote. And interestingly, White Dwarf magazine goes up for pre-order next weekend, the March edition of White Dwarf. And they have teased that issue of White Dwarf has rules in it for running Zotes in Kill Team. Now that means they're not going to be including rules so you can use old metal Zotes that you have to hunt down on eBay. That means our Zote miniatures are coming soon, and the Zotes are coming in a Blackstone Fortress expansion, which means I would expect our next Blackstone Fortress expansion to be coming out in March, possibly for pre-order, not this weekend, but the weekend after, for launch in the last weekend of March. That's my prediction. So obviously once I find out for sure, I will put it on the channel. But I don't really want to talk much more about Blackstone Fortress. I have a huge playlist of Blackstone Fortress content. I have broken down the game itself. I have reviewed every single expansion. I have rambled aimlessly for many hours of content on it. So I'm not going to talk too much more on Blackstone Fortress here now. But obviously, I do feel like Blackstone Fortress is the culmination of everything that has come before it, but I also feel that it is its own thing. I have all three of these games in my collection, and I wouldn't get rid of any of them, and I would play them all at different times. Like I say, Silver Tower to me is the cooperative experience. Hammerhal is the one versus many experience. And for me, Blackstone Fortress, obviously it's a very good cooperative game, and you can play it with an adversary, although I feel that mode isn't as good, isn't as strong. But for me, Blackstone Fortress really excels as a solo experience. And the reason I feel that is because it really does feel like it's a squad-based tactical game. I feel like rather than controlling an individual hero, controlling the team, it feels like you're a squad that's been dropped behind enemy lines. And I really feel that it excels as a solo experience in that sense. Obviously also very good for cooperative, but for me, if I'm playing solo, this is the choice. And that pretty much brings us up to date, I guess. I'm sorry, this has been a very long, very meandering wander through my mind. Really just an opportunity to bang on about one of my favourite series of games of all time. And I do apologise, really, but you guys being awesome and helping me to get to 2,000 subscribers has just gifted me with a platform just to bang on about this. So never one to miss an opportunity to talk about Warhammer Quest. But I really do feel like I've probably talked for long enough. I obviously haven't even scratched the surface of all these games and what they offer. There's so much more than I can say in one video about how fantastic all of these games are, and how much I love them, and how much I'm very happy that Quest came back. But that is it from me for now. Thank you so much for listening. If you have stuck with me to this point, you are an absolute legend. If you've liked the video, please consider pressing the like button. If you've really liked the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully I haven't put you all off, and I will see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.